Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. This episode's coming at you a little late, and I wanted to talk a little bit about Jerry West and his impact in the NBA, in basketball, as a culture at large, and kind of a little bit of a ripple effect of him passing and generally just his existence as a player, and why it tells us a lot about the ring culture aspect that we have fallen in love with as basketball fans, as basketball media has really fallen in love with. So I want to take some time in the beginning here to talk about Jerry West. For those of you that follow my written pieces on Medium, I recently wrote a piece about Jerry West passing away. And, lately, I want to say over the past few years, we've lost a lot of titans of the old NBA from the 60s and 70s. We lost Bill Russell, Willis Reed, recently Bill Walton, a lot of iconic NBA figures, who really dominated the landscape during that time. And Jerry West is just the latest of those. And every time that happens, I find myself being compelled to write a piece about it. And usually they're not super long, just a recap of that person's career, what they meant. So for Bill Russell, it was not just all the championships in Boston, it was also the social activism, his role in the civil rights movement. For Willis Reed, it was what he meant in the context of the history of basketball with his Game 7 limping on the court situation that helped to inspire the Knicks to win a championship. And with Bill Walton, it was really just about his positivity and his zest for life. When you look at Jerry West, and I thought, all right, here's a 1,000 word piece or 1,500 maybe words that I could put together about Jerry West. I'm no Laker fan, and but I've always admired Jerry West from afar, and not just obviously was introduced to him as an executive, not as much as a player. I'm just not old enough to have remembered him or been around for him to play. But the piece ended up being over 2,500 words because as I was doing my research on him, I just found it so fascinating that his story was so much more layered, I think, than a lot of other stories that you hear about athletes and the story of their life. And Jerry West's story starts with his childhood where he was maliciously abused by his father and to a lesser extent his mother. And it hardened him. It made him complicated and difficult, right? And I think he was kind of a type of person who talked about his mental health issues long before it was cool for an athlete to do so, right? He wrote a book years ago where he was outlining all this, and this was before Kevin Love or DeMar DeRozan or any of these other current NBA players would come out and talk about depression and talk about their mental health struggles. And Jerry West, he in his book West by West, he kind of details the feelings of suicidal thoughts that he had, the way he approached life as a result of the abuse that he encountered. Anytime something wouldn't go right, that's when the belt came out or the hands were raised, and whatever the case may be. And he found basketball as an escape, which I think is incredibly relatable. Anybody who's dealt with any sort of hardship in life, that there's something. It's not necessarily sports, but it could be movies, it could be music, it could be writing, it could be any number of outlets that allow you to just briefly escape from this tormented life that you're living at that time, right? And maybe it helps you dive deeper into that medium, and then you're able to overcome it in your own way. And that's what Jerry West did with basketball. He would just meticulously work at it. Eventually, He goes on to West Virginia, becomes the greatest player in that school's history. Then he's drafted by the Lakers, and I think it's incredibly telling that he was made the logo of the NBA when they redesigned their logo in the late 60s while he was still playing. I think that's an interesting idea, right? That this is an active player that we're going to go ahead and make the symbol of our league. And, a lot of people have casually mentioned over the years, oh, it doesn't need to be updated, but I don't think it will be updated for a very long time because Jerry West did, as a player, what the NBA wants every player to be. He won at a very high level. He handled his losses with grace. He never cheated the game. He was always playing with maximum intensity and maximum effort. He was just so intense and so driven by winning. And I think the NBA wants that of all of its players, right? They want them to take the game seriously, to compete at the highest level and give maximum effort every single night, like Jerry West did. A lot of people, of course, will remember West as a player for his losses, right? And so he played 14 years, got to the finals 9 times, and only won once later in his career in the 70s with the older Wilt Chamberlain. And it's something that is just unfortunate when you're in the midst, when you happen to exist when a dynasty is existing. We always like to talk about, write movies about, write books about, record podcasts, make videos about the teams that won, right? It's not so much about, but we don't really look at how good the teams that they beat were. We glorify the 90s Bulls, but we also kind of gloss over that era's Jazz teams, Sonics teams, Suns and Blazers teams, teams that are very good, but were had the unfortunate task of running into a dynasty in the Bulls. And it's the same situation back then because the Lakers had a really good roster, with Gail Goodrich and West and Elgin Baylor, but they were going up against a Boston Celtics dynasty that had one of the best centers to ever play basketball. And in a league that was dominated by centers at the time, that was a non-starter. So they lost a lot of times. West is famous, of course, for being the only player in NBA history to lose in NBA Finals but still be named Finals MVP. I think LeBron in 2017 would have had a legitimate case for that happening, right? Because he was just magnificent even in a losing effort. But as of now, it is Jerry West's title to hold, right? As whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, it's kind of like a black hat type situation, but he has it. He threw and the thing about it is that a lot of you may look at it as like, oh wow, went to 9 finals, only won one. That's it's kind of like the Buffalo Bills of the early '90s, who went to 4 Super Bowls and couldn't win one. Wow, this guy must have choked in the clutch, right? But here's the weird thing: his nickname was Mr. Clutch. He was amazing in the playoffs. His numbers elevated in the playoffs. There was a playoff series one year, or a playoff, not entire run, a playoff run, excuse me, where he averaged 40 points a game. Now, think about how hard that is. It's hard enough to score points in the NBA. It's even harder to do it in the playoffs. And he consistently, on the road to the finals, did it to average 40. Not just got 40 one time, averaging 40 over 10 plus games. Any way you slice it, that's incredibly impressive, right? West was also an all-star every single year he played. So all 14 years he was named to the all-star team, which is, again, incredibly impressive. He was very ahead of his time, right? He was a high-pace, great shooting player that probably would have done so well in this era. Just as an efficient shooter. And he played before there was a three-point shot. Who knows how many more points he would have averaged, how many more points he would have scored. Maybe he wins some titles if there's a three-point shot and there's that great equalizer of the big man, which is the three. So when he retired, he was clearly one of the best Lakers ever. And since then, I think we've let others' accomplishments overshadow him, right? So after West retired, you of course had the Magic Johnson era. You had the tail end of the Kareem era. Obviously, Kareem was brought on as when West was coaching the Lakers shortly after he retired as a player. And you had Kobe Bryant, you have Shaq, LeBron James, of course, now a Laker, Anthony Davis as a Laker. These great players. So when you start looking and thinking about the greatest Lakers of all time, I think a lot of times the West gets lost in the shuffle sometimes. People will go to Kobe and Magic first and second, I think, then maybe Kareem. And in whatever order, those are your top three. Then some people say Shaq. Some people might go Elgin Baylor, West's teammate. Some people might go with George Mikan, going even further back. And some people might even go James Worthy, right? As a guy who won championships. And I think sometimes West gets left out of that conversation a little bit when it comes to like the Mount Rushmore 5 greatest Lakers of all time. Jeannie Buss famously, when asked about her five most important Lakers figures, decided to omit West to include Phil Jackson. And I mean, it's hard to argue. Phil Jackson helped bring 5 titles to the team, and that's kind of the ring culture aspect that we'll touch on a little bit later. But I want to kind of pivot here because Jerry's impact is just not just as him as a player, even though he had a fantastic playing career, but probably more so as an executive. He took over the Lakers in 1980, 79, 80, and was their general manager, president of basketball operations from then until the year 2000. So think about what he did with the Lakers alone there. He helped to draft Magic Johnson, even though he had his reservations about that. Which helped to usher in the Showtime Lakers, which helped to maximize Kareem's extended career, brought a bunch of titles to the Lakers, right, throughout the decade of the 80s. Then, after that was over, with Magic's AIDS diagnosis, Kareem's retirement, he was one of the first guys to really see talent in European players. And he drafts Vlade Divac from Yugoslavia at the time, and develops him. And you could argue he ushered in this era of a high level European players kind of coming over from Europe into the NBA. And you look at the game today, it's littered with European talent. A lot of that credit does need to go to Jerry West. Then in the 90s, after he builds, a competent team with Divac, Nick Van Exel, Eddie Jones, Glenn Rice, these type of guys, they go to the second round, but they need something more, right? In 1996, it happens. He makes a trade with Charlotte to bring in Kobe Bryant. Think about it for a second. What happens to the trajectory of Kobe's career if he stays in Charlotte? Now, Charlotte in the mid-90s wasn't a bad team by any stretch of the imagination. They were in the playoffs. They were in the mix. B.J. Armstrong and Compton there from Chicago. That's when they still had Glenn Rice there, Larry Johnson, Alonzo Mourning. They had good players there in the mid-90s. So you would assume, Kobe could have carved out a good career there. But we think of Kobe so much as a Laker, and we idolize him so much because of what he did as a Laker. And I know a lot of like smaller team fan bases won't like hearing that, but it kind of means more when you win on this at a certain franchise. At the end of the day, if you win as a Laker, it's going to mean more than if you win as a New Orleans member of the New Orleans Pelicans, right? There's just a prestige, a cachet that comes with those type of franchises. And I'm not saying it's fair, but that's just kind of the way we look at it. The Lakers get a lot of attention. So as a result, when you're doing great things, you're going to get that attention, right? So Kobe might not have ever been Kobe if that wasn't the case, if West didn't make that deal. Then he goes ahead and signs Shaquille O'Neal in free agency, probably one of the biggest free agent signings of all time. It helped to build towards the three-peat that they have in the early 2000s and really helps to mold the modern reality of the Lakers. West was a part of the Lakers being the bridesmaid, not the bride, right? Being the second best all the time. And he, as an executive, elevated them to being in that number one spot. He was the architect of the Showtime Lakers, and he was the architect of the Kobe Shaq Lakers. So between those, you're talking 8 championships. So it's hard to argue with that. So that's him as a Laker. In addition to the fact that when he was a player, he probably helped to elevate Wilt Chamberlain in conversations, because there's a huge difference between winning one title and winning 2 titles. When you win one, you're Dirk Nowitzki, right? Great player, got a title, good job. When you win 2, you become into that all-time great conversation, right? That's the difference. It's kind of like in football, you have it with like Peyton Manning and Aaron Rodgers. I think most people will agree Peyton Manning is the better quarterback ultimately, because he won more, right? Aaron Rodgers has that one title and still waiting for that second one. Maybe it happens as a Jet, but it kind of matters in the way we view sports. So then from there, you go on and he goes to Memphis. What does he do there? He builds a team around Pau Gasol and Jason Williams, Shane Battier, these type of guys, and takes Memphis from being an embarrassment from when they were in Vancouver into being a legitimate contender. They eventually, after he leaves, trade Pau Gasol, and it helps to set up the grit and grind era. Memphis Grizzlies with Zach Randolph and Tony Allen and Mike Conley. So he helped revitalize the Memphis franchise. Right, so then what does he do? He goes to the Clippers, and that's the last job he held before he unfortunately passed away. And he takes them from being in the shadow of the Lakers to being the team that gets the free agents. All of a sudden, they get Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. Russell Westbrook's playing for the Clippers. That's a big deal, and Jerry was a big architect of that. I think without that, who knows how successful their move to their new arena would be, right? Maybe it gets delayed further or whatever, but that is kind of, you talk about that stuff, right? What happened with the Lakers? What happened with the Grizzlies? What happened with the Clippers? And the ripple effects across the rest of the league. Jerry West has had his fingerprints on the NBA for almost the entirety of its modern existence. Really, from the 60s to today, there's something that's been affected by Jerry West. He was at summer league games. He was constantly scouting, constantly working, constantly just in love and obsessed with the game of basketball. And that's what makes his loss so profound, right? And what this has made me think about while I was researching him, mostly as a player, is ring culture. So if you ever talk to a LeBron and Michael Jordan fan and they're having a debate about who's better, inevitably the Jordan fan is going to say 6-0 in the finals, right? You can't beat that. 6-0 in the finals. Every time my guy got there, he won, right? 2 3-peats, right? That kind of thing. And the LeBron fan counters with the fact, like, yeah, but is it better to lose before you get to the finals or to lose in the finals? Because in LeBron's case, he ran through the East, got to the finals 10 times, and has gone 4-6 in the finals. And whereas, so you kind of go both ways, but it seems like we kind of elevate or reduce a player based on what they did or didn't do in the finals, for better or worse. We do it to Wilt Chamberlain. It's why Russell is elevated over him. We do it with LeBron and Jordan, and Kobe isn't as good as Jordan because Kobe only won 5, Jordan won 6. Right? Kobe lost to the 04 Pistons in the finals. Kobe lost to the 08 Celtics in the finals. Jordan never lost in the finals, right? We measure the greatness of a player off of what they did in terms of ring count. How many championships did they win? Who did they elevate? That sort of thing. And with Jerry West, we have a contradiction, right? Here's a great player, inarguably one of the 20 best players to ever pick up a basketball. He won once, lost 9 times, or 8 times, excuse me. So do you take away from his greatness because you want to elevate somebody that has 2 or 3 rings Like Clyde Drexler plays the same position, has 2 rings, right? And is he better than Jerry West because he has more rings only? Probably not, right? So I think that what his passing has like triggered in my mind is why do we focus on the ring count so much? Why do we care so much about how many times you've hoisted the Larry O'Brien trophy as opposed to appreciating the greatness of a player? I always felt like comparing eras is dumb because I mentioned this when we were talking about Bill Walton, right? It was he was great in his era, right? And that's kind of what we need to focus on is that his greatness in his era. Comparing him to what happened in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, it's just irrelevant because the game changes so much, right? And when we focus only on rings, I think somebody like James Harden is going to have to reckon with this, and he's never won one, right? So it's even worse. Where he changed so much about the way that offense is played in the NBA. But historically, he might just be a footnote because he hasn't won a ring and hasn't won multiple rings and exerted his dominance in that way. When, as we look at the Boston Celtics who just won a title, a lot of people were talking throughout the playoffs like, oh, wow, what an easy path they have had to the finals, right? They play Miami without Jimmy Butler, then they play Cleveland without Donovan Mitchell for a few games. And Tyrese Halliburton gets hurt in the conference finals, and Halliburton's only there because the Sixers, Bucks, and Knicks all got incredibly injured at the wrong possible time, right? And then Boston ends up playing Dallas, who Luka's kind of hobbled, but they're also overmatched. It was a bad matchup. If you would argue if they played against Denver, maybe it ends up differently, right? But at the end of the day, Boston got the ring, right? That's the thing. Every championship has there's caveats, there's things that happen, there's things that go wrong. It doesn't mean that one player is inherently bad and the other player that won is ultimately good, right? That's just kind of the theater of basketball, the theater of sports in general, right? So when we kind of boil it down only to the ring count, we don't really account for those circumstances. And I think Jerry West is an example of why we should probably consider those circumstances. We look at a guy like Allen Iverson, who in the modern era now of, a focus on 3-point shooting and a focus on efficiency is kind of, discredited and underrated to a certain aspect. When I was growing up, Allen Iverson was one of my favorite players. And why was he one of my favorite players? Because he played with tenacity. He obviously had his crossovers, his moves, and he could score points in bunches, and he was just a phenomenal player to behold. But as history looks back, it's like, wow, look at this guy who shoots 30 times a game, inefficient. Yeah, he dragged his team to a finals one time, but never could get it done. Me first player, that's kind of the rap on Iverson now. And we choose to forget that this guy at 5'11", 6 feet tall, invoked a level of fear in defenses that you don't typically see somebody that small invoking fear. And I think that when we focus on all this focus on rings, and you can kind of blame Michael Jordan or mostly Michael Jordan's fans for this, where they've peddled the whole idea that you're nothing without the ring. And it means that we start discrediting players. We start belittling players to further our agenda about the player that we like more. And Jerry West was the antithesis of that, right? Again, a great player who ran into the wrong team at the wrong time, right? I was watching the Vice documentary, The Uninterrupted show about the 90s Sonics with Kemp and Peyton, and how, they would win 50, 60 games, and, they ran into like the Utah Jazz in the 90s who were excellent. Then they ran into the Bulls in 96 who had, up until then, the greatest regular season of all time. Yeah, you're running into all-time great teams. That happens. Timelines are messed up that way, right? There are countless examples of that, like the Toronto Raptors of DeRozan and Lowry. Really good team. LeBron was just better, right? And does that mean that DeMar DeRozan is a trash player? That Kyle Lowry is a trash player? Absolutely not. They just ran into the wrong guy, And as I kind of reflect upon what Jerry West meant to basketball, and I just think about he's a reminder of that nuance is important when it comes to the way we talk about the sport in any sport. And nuance is important to be able to really nail down, what makes a player great, what doesn't make him great. To me, it's really holistic, right? A great player makes you feel stuff that other players don't make you feel. He or she makes you jump out of your seat when the play happens, when they do things that are just remarkable to you. And think about somebody like Nikola Jokic, right? Who lost in the second round this year. But he constantly does things that just make you, open your mouth in awe. And that's why we watch, right? We don't watch to count rings. We watch because it's captivating, it's storytelling, it's witnessing greatness, it's witnessing feats of athleticism that we would never be able to replicate on our own, right? And I think that as we think back on Jerry West, maybe the best way to honor him is to watch the game with the intent that he watched the game and the way he played the game, right? And to kind of exercise a little bit more nuance and appreciation for what we're seeing and don't simply abide by the ring count. All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in for another episode of the Deep Cover podcast. Really appreciate you tuning in. If you like the podcast, please consider subscribing and following on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you're interested in any of my written pieces, those are available at omarzaran.medium.com. Link to that will be in the show notes. Until next time, see you later.